was here today. So my name is Carla Coley. I'm the facilitator tonight, and it's my job to take us through the agenda to help us answer as many questions as we can tonight, and also to respect the time that you've given us and make sure that we end the meeting as we planned. We have a couple of people on my team helping to take notes in the background, and then all the others on the slide there are people who will be participating in either making the presentation or in answering some of your questions. Next slide. We are recording the meeting, and we will endeavor to post the recording early next week. And then just for your information too, we do have about 180 now, 180 people participating in the meeting. So welcome everyone. It's great to have you. Next slide, please. We're going to start the meeting with a land acknowledgement, which is a small but important way to acknowledge the presence of Indigenous peoples of past and present. We acknowledge the land that we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Next slide, please. So we have about an hour and a half with you tonight, and we're going to go through the information that we have in two parts. The first part will be a presentation on affordable definitions. That's about 15 minutes, followed by about a 10-minute question and answer session. And the second part is about a 25-minute presentation on inclusionary zoning and a half an hour of question and answers. We will be using the chat function during this meeting. So anytime during the meeting, you are welcome to use that chat function to provide your thoughts and comments to the city, to ask questions of the city, and to actually connect with each other, which is something we get to do at in-person meetings, but not so much virtually. So we're trying to give you that opportunity here today. When you do chat, please chat with all panelists or all attendees rather than sending it to individual people. You'll find the chat button on your phone in the middle is a button, or as a pop-up on the bottom right if you have your laptop on. Hang on for just 1 second there on the slide transfer. And during the question and answer, you'll also have the opportunity we will also have the opportunity to hear from you live. And we're going to focus those live questions, or sort of focus that live activity on questions that you might have for the city staff who are available here to answer your questions. And you can raise your hand by going to the participants tab or the participants pop-up on the bottom. And you'll see at the bottom of that a little hand button. Or for those of you who might be on the phone, it's dial 3, or star 3, sorry. Next slide, please. And just a couple of participant reminders. We welcome your questions. Please respect our time together by asking one question and being brief. And be a good listener and keep an open mind. Be respectful and considerate as you engage with the city and with each other on the chat and when we open the mic. And note that abusive, degrading, or hateful language is not acceptable. And if it does arise, unfortunately, we will have to limit the chat function. Slide 8, please. So this is a great graphic that I've added to remind us that we all come from different experiences and have varied opinions on the inclusionary zoning topic. So some want more, some want less, but really the reality is that we all come from a different place. It's been the city's job over the last 2 years to be listening to what everyone has to say and to try and strike a balance that works best for the city. And the result of that listening is really what we're here to listen to today, and what the city will be presenting to us today, and then also presenting at Planning and Housing Committee next week. So tonight, we're asking you to listen objectively, ask your questions to help you understand, and let the city know if there's anything that they might have missed. And I'm going to take the time now to pass it to Graham to start the presentation on affordable definitions.
Okay, thanks for getting us started tonight. So before I get into talking about the definitions in specific, I just want to highlight our Housing TO 2020 to 2030 action plan. This got passed by City Council last year. And within that action plan, we're going to be talking about 2 of 76 actions there tonight. So 2 of those actions were implementing an inclusionary zoning policy, and the other was adopting income-based definitions for affordable housing. But like I said, there were 76 actions there, 13 strategic directions, with the city committing over $8.5 billion to help address challenges across the housing spectrum. Specifically, as it sort of relates to some of our topics tonight, this plan did set the target of approving 40,000 new affordable rental homes in this 10-year period. So what we're talking about tonight is, relatively speaking, a narrow part, but an important part of the housing spectrum. The city has policies and programs meant to address, everything from emergency shelters all the way up to market home ownership. Many people here, I think, have been involved with a lot of the consultation we've been doing around different policies and programs, like that around modular supportive housing on the lower end of the spectrum, or such as expanding housing options in neighborhoods at the market end of the spectrum. Tonight, though, we want to focus on policies around affordable rental housing and affordable home ownership. And before we do that, I think it's good just to remind ourselves, what are we talking about when we talk about affordable housing? So first, in general, housing is considered affordable when it costs less than 30% of a household's before tax income. When it comes to affordable rental housing and affordable home ownership housing, though, these are specific types of housing that the city looks to secure and which we define in the official plan. So affordable rental housing and affordable ownership housing is housing where we have set prices or set rents that are meant to be lower than market housing. And it helps fill a gap, especially for those who might have incomes too high to qualify for social housing, but who struggle to afford housing in the actual market. It's important to note that affordable rental housing and affordable home ownership are distinct from programs like social housing, which have rents geared to income. So they're more targeted at specific incomes, while affordable rental housing and affordable ownership, like I said, have set prices that are just meant to be more affordable than the market. So with that, I'm going to start diving into our policy updates around the affordable definitions and what we've done to sort of take heed of council's direction to adopt some income-based definitions instead of our old market-based definitions. And as I do that, just some more housing context that I think is important to understand is, and I think everybody on this, that's here tonight probably appreciates this, is the Toronto housing market is very challenging to navigate, and we need more housing across the spectrum. According to the 2016 census, though, renters were about half of the city's households, and 1 in 2 of those renter households is spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So that means their housing is not affordable to them. Maybe even more dire is a quarter of renters are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. And then just finally, 1 in 5 households are living in unsuitable housing, meaning they don't have enough bedrooms for their household size based on our national occupancy standard. Some key terms I'll talk about as I go through these definitions, and I think it's helpful if we all have a common understanding. Average asking market rents are what you might expect to pay if you were looking for an apartment today in the city of Toronto. Average market rent, which is what we use to define affordable rents right now, and I'll talk more about that, is the average rent charged at all tenanted units and purpose-built rental units across the city. So if we took everybody that's living in a 1-bedroom apartment right now and averaged their rent, that would be average market rent for a 1-bedroom unit. And then the last thing we'll use, because it relates to our new definitions, is income percentiles. And it's really a measure of how a household's income compares to other households across the city. So for example, if you are in the 60th percentile of income, you earn more than 60% of Toronto households, but less than the remaining 40%. And just on the right, I've got a breakdown of how 1-person renter households break down by income percentiles. Okay, so why is affordable housing important? I think we all intuitively know some of this, but housing is super important to just the success of our city. Our Toronto Housing Charter spells this out. But for us to have a successful economy, to welcome newcomers, to meet all of our environmental goals, and to make sure that everybody who lives here can live healthily, can succeed, and that we guarantee the social well-being of our residents, getting housing right and delivering housing across our spectrum is important. And affordable rental housing and affordable ownership housing is a key piece of this puzzle. But more than this, and I've already hinted at this, but market housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable for many Toronto residents. I talked about some of those stats. Those were from the 2016 census. And since then, we've seen prices rise and rents rise faster than incomes, faster than inflation. So they're becoming more unaffordable by the year. What we see here, though, is sort of what some measures of asking rents in the market are on average. So the first is CMHC reports on asking rents for vacant units annually. And I've also put in what the Toronto Real Estate Board reported for recent rentals and their asking prices. And what we see is many key workers across the city of Toronto, they can't even afford asking rents for bachelor units or one-bedroom units. You know, looking at grocery store clerks, security guards, early childhood educators, dental assistants, paralegals, many jobs. We could have listed more. You know, even a registered nurse, a job that takes a lot of education, they could really only afford a one-bedroom unit on their own at market rents. So you think about the challenges that single parents face when they're also raising children and maybe need more than just a one-bedroom unit, or even dual income households with a couple of these lower income jobs. They can't afford the type of housing that they need. And that's why these definitions are critically important. So as I noted, right now in the official plan, our definitions are based on average market rent. That means as the market goes up, so do these affordable rents. And because they're different than asking market rents, these rents often go up even if asking rents slow down. So for example, average market rents went up over the last couple of years, even as rent growth slowed due to the pandemic. And this is in part due to turnover. As people leave their rent-controlled apartments and they're leased out to new tenants, their rents will go up. But this is the basis for which we've been setting our definition of affordable rental housing and affordable ownership housing is this average market rent measure. And like I've noted, we've been asked to look at a new income-based definition, and I'll talk about what that's looking like in the next few slides. But first, I want to point out that we're not alone in looking at an income-based definition for affordable housing. In general, most US affordable housing programs are based off of something called area median income. So really they're looking at what can the median household in this area afford, and how do we make sure housing is set at 100% or 80% of that. So New York City's mandatory inclusionary zoning policy has different set aside targets based on what level of area median income the housing units being provided will target. Vancouver has a program called the Moderate Income Rental Housing Pilot Program, and it was designed specifically to target incomes from $30,000 up to $80,000. Likewise, the new Federal Rapid Housing Initiative is built around making sure that housing is affordable, meaning households would pay less than 30% of their income, and is targeted to households in severe housing need or at imminent risk of homelessness. And then finally, and something we've sort of looked at as we make these new definitions, that Ontario's provincial policy statement states that affordable housing should be affordable to low and moderate income households. So, and that's the lowest 60% of income earners. And in the case of affordable rental housing, the lowest 60% of renter household incomes. So with that in mind, we're looking at a new affordable rent and affordable rental housing definition. I've simplified the text here a bit, but what we're looking to do is set affordable rent at the lower of our current average market rent definition, or a rent that would be affordable to some specific indicator households. So for studio units, that indicator household is a one-person renter household at the 50th percentile income level. For one-bedroom units, it's a one-person household at the 60th percentile income level. For two-bedroom units, it's a two-person household at the 60th percentile level. And for three-bedroom units, a three-person household at the 60th percentile level. And the reason we picked these household sizes was in part informed by that national occupancy standard. So the idea is a single person should qualify for studio and one-bedroom units. A single parent with one dependent should be part of what informs who can afford a two-bedroom unit. And likewise, a single parent with two children that each need their own bedroom should be part of what informs our prices for three-bedroom units. What this results in is our new definition will lead to the rents at the very right of this. Average market rents are in the left-hand column. The new rents that would be based off the income limits alone are in the middle column. And then yes, the lower of the two options in the right. So what we see is the big changes here really are to studio and one-bedroom units. And this is resulting from making sure that those single income earners or even low income two-person households will be able to access these and that they'll be affordable to those households. Two-bedroom units will remain priced at average market rent for the time being because that average market rent is lower than what would be affordable to the 60th percentile two-person renter household, while affordable rent for three-bedroom units would decrease slightly. One of the other things that's important to note, moving towards an income-based definition means that rent can only grow with incomes. And as we get new income data, so for example, from the next census when it's released, we'll be able to update these. But between censuses, we'll generally look to grow these rents in line with inflation or the type of guidelines that lead to the province's rent increases. Guideline rent increases. Likewise, we're looking to move towards an income-based definition for affordable ownership housing. There's a couple things to note here. So first, we've done a similar thing where we look at the 60th percentile and then we work backwards. So a 60th percentile household, we've set them as being able to afford a 3-bedroom unit, 50th percentile for 2-bedroom units, 40th percentile for 1-bedroom units, 30th percentile for studio units. On top of that, we're also being a bit more critical or thinking more deeply about what needs to go into total housing costs to make sure that the incomes we're targeting actually can afford affordable ownership housing. So our old affordable ownership housing definition didn't include condo fees as part of your housing expenses. So it looked at what would be affordable based on your mortgage payments and your property taxes, but not condo fees you might have to pay. And given most new housing in the city is coming in the form of condos, we thought the inclusion of condo fees in terms of what will be affordable to different incomes was really important. This is the outcomes of what the old definition set affordable prices at and what the new definition will. And what you see is generally across the board, it's leading to prices that are about $50,000 lower than the old definition. And really, the decrease is, in part from going to incomes, but in large part also because of that inclusion of condo fees, bringing down the amount of money you would have left over to spend on your mortgage. This sort of shows some different typical households, what they might be able to afford under, on the top row, our proposed affordable rent definition. On the second row, the old affordable rent definition or average market rent. The third row is our proposed affordable ownership definition. And the final row is that CMHC vacant rent that I showed earlier. And what we see is really these new definitions really do help, the low to moderate single income earners. And likewise, our new affordable ownership definition means something like an early childhood educator and a bank clerk with 2 children. They would qualify for both a 3-bedroom affordable rental unit, but also a 2-bedroom affordable ownership unit. But meanwhile, they wouldn't have been able to afford either, a 2 or a 3-bedroom unit when looking at asking market rents. One of the things to highlight here is this chart sort of shows bars based off of, at the low end, not spending more than 30% of your income on housing. But obviously, there's households in need that, might not be able to access social housing. And this doesn't say that, if you don't earn $33,000, you can't qualify for a studio unit. It's just showing the prices to which this would be affordable. There are a few next steps for this. Updating our official plan is really the first part of moving towards an income-based approach to affordable housing. So I should say, yeah. So we'll be bringing this to committee next week, and after that, it will proceed to council. But following that, there's more steps for us to do to make sure that we actually do implement an income-based approach to affordable housing. So in 2022, the Housing Secretariat is going to complete a review of city programs and policies related to affordable housing. Some notable ones under that bucket are programs like our Open Door affordable housing program, which provides fee and property tax exemptions to affordable units, as well as our Housing Now program. And what that review will be doing is looking at how those programs can implement the new definition, recognizing that with lower rents means there might need to be some changes to how those programs work, what type of funding they need, or what are the operating characteristics for the programs. Following that, there'll be another report in 2023, which will look to update what's called the city's municipal housing facility bylaw. And this bylaw is the bylaw that really gives the city authority to permit funding or fee exemptions to affordable housing units. So with that, I can close it off for questions about our recommended affordable housing definitions.
Great, thanks, Graham. So we've got a few questions coming in via the chat function. And as I mentioned, if you're interested, please feel free to use the participant list to raise your hand, and we'll get to those questions in a minute. I think mostly some of the questions coming in really, Graham, relate to the people that may not quite have the kind of income that fit in this category of affordability. So maybe you can just remind us, I know you had a spectrum in the beginning, but not everyone might have been joined at that time.
So, I mean, the city's working on housing solutions across the housing spectrum. So, updating our affordable rent definitions, building in IZ are just two of those actions. So, I mean, we're looking at ways to expand even more affordable housing, how we can maintain and hopefully expand some of our social housing stock. But we also have other programs. So often we can layer more funding onto affordable rental units to potentially secure them at a lower price. So that's one thing we'll obviously be exploring. Another thing to note, though, is we do have programs like rent supplements or other ways to bring rents down to make them more affordable to lower income households. So there certainly are other programs that we can either layer on to the units we secure as affordable rental housing, or that just from the get-go are securing deeper affordability than we'll be securing through these definitions.
Great. So I think that answers a number of the questions about people on some type of a lower income assisted situation. So there's been some other questions too about one of them is who will be defining and maintaining affordable rent, the affordable rent over time. Is that something?
Yeah. So we'll look to update those incomes annually. So what we'll do is we'll look at the most recent census results and then adjust those results based on changes to inflation. So that's how we came up with the 2021 numbers. Is we looked at the incomes from the 2016 census, which really reported 2015 incomes, and then have used inflation to estimate what we think incomes would be today. Once we get the new 2021 census, we'll update everything again, and then grow incomes from that point forward. So every time we get a new census, there'll be sort of a relook at what incomes actually are.
Okay, and it'll be the city that does that component of it. Is that what I'm hearing? Great. There is a question on whether you could elaborate why the older affordability definition is the one that continues to apply to 2-bedroom rental units.
Okay, yeah. So it's not that the older definition applies, but because average market rent was lower than the income-based measure, average market rent will be used. If that income measure drops below average market rent, we would then switch to the income-based measure at that point in time. So our definition says that affordable rent is the lower of those two things.
Okay, great, thank you. And there is a question here related to whether, or I guess a comment, that basic utilities should be included in shelter costs, but also too a question about what assumption was made for condo fees in the ownership definition.
Okay, so for our rental definition, it's all inclusive of utilities. And then for condo fees, we've assumed 60 cents per square foot based off of some typical unit sizes that are sort of informed by the city's affordable housing design requirements or design guidelines.
Okay. It may be helpful to pull up the slides again. There's some questions about where the income examples based on career and job came from, and just sort of a desire to see the affordable rent and affordable ownership slide again. So I'm not sure we have time and no one's raising their hand. So perhaps you might be able to pop those back up on and have a through them again.
Okay, there we go. So I think this slide is the one I'll use. So we took all of the incomes from the Government of Canada's Job Bank, and we're looking at jobs in the Toronto market area. And these incomes are based off of the median income for those jobs. So certainly there's people in those jobs that earn more, some that earn less, but this was the median reported by the Job Bank.
Okay. There was a comment about, could you clarify a 2-bedroom for a single income parent with a child, please? Was that the 60th percentile of income?
So 60th, so I mean, the price is based off of the 60th percentile 2-person renter household income, but certainly a single parent with a child would be eligible to rent. So for example, on this slide, we're showing a registered nurse with a child would be able to afford an affordable 2-bedroom unit.
And this is gross income, is that correct? That's
This is gross, yeah, before tax income.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, give me a minute. I'm just reading this one question here. So there's a couple questions just for those people who are raising them that may actually apply to, in part, to the inclusionary zoning component of the meeting. So I'm holding off on some of those until we get to that inclusionary zoning component, because, and we'll bring them up at that point in time. There is a question here about, oh, it's moving pretty quick here. There is a question here about how affordable units will be granted and assigned. But again, I think that's more from the inclusionary zoning perspective, unless there's something in the affordable definition that relates to that.
There's not, no.
No, okay. I'm thinking that we've covered, for the most part, the questions that actually relate to the affordable definition, and that most of these other questions actually, I guess the only other one that might jump out here and might be helpful is there was a question about whether or not we have a sense as to how many people fit this affordable definition in Toronto.
So, I mean, it's hard to say. You know, this is meant to cover a range of income. So as you can see, we're looking, you know, on the slide at serving incomes from about 33,000 up to almost 110,000. And if we look at some of the, you know, income brackets, this is a wide range. So we're serving from about the 30th, sorry, the, you know, a middle income one-person renter household, which is probably around the 30th to 40th percentile of all households in the city of Toronto, up to this, you know, over 100,000. So I mean, it's a wide range and really meant to represent low to moderate income households across the city of Toronto. So I mean, you can see this here. Like I say, it goes from about 33,000 to over 100,000 for that 3-bedroom affordable ownership unit. So it is a relatively wide range of incomes we're looking to serve with these definitions.
Okay, so it could serve a large portion of the population in the city. Great. I think that there is, as I mentioned, there are other questions and other comments here, but I think it might be a good idea, Christine, because many of them relate to inclusionary zoning, for us to continue on. So we're just going to switch the presenter to Christine now, who's going to continue on with the presentation about inclusionary zoning, and we won't forget about the questions that have been raised to date. So actually, maybe just hold on before that. If there's anybody, last call for anybody who might want to raise their hand with a question related specifically to the affordable definition. Seeing none, I think you can go ahead, Christine.
Okay, thanks, Carla. I'm gonna pull up my slides. Hi, everyone. Good to see so many people joining the conversation tonight. As Carla mentioned, I'll go through a presentation on inclusionary zoning, then we'll have more time for questions. So please bear with me. There's lots of information. I have about a 20 to 25-minute presentation, and then we can take some more questions. So for those of you who may be new to this conversation and are wondering what inclusionary zoning is, or what we mean when we say IZ, really it's a planning tool that allows the city to require a certain percentage of affordable housing in new developments. It's a tool that leverages growth in the housing market to deliver more inclusive and more affordable housing opportunities. And the requirements for affordable housing are established upfront in the city's official plan and zoning bylaw instead of negotiated on a site-by-site basis. The requirements for IZ would be mandatory for certain developments, meaning that even before a development application is submitted, everyone is aware of that affordable housing requirement. So as Carla mentioned, we are really in the final stretch of the policy development process for inclusionary zoning. Many of you have been engaged in this process with us for the past 2.5 years. So far, we've undertaken 7 public meetings, dozens of stakeholder meetings, facilitated a number of community-led workshops, and received hundreds of written submissions. We've also to date completed 3 rounds of background analysis. This analysis and the input we received from you has really informed the proposed IZ policy that we will be presenting to the Planning and Housing Committee next week on October 28th. At this meeting, we will also be tabling draft IZ implementation guidelines for continued consultation. And then following the committee meeting, we expect that City Council will make a decision on the proposed policy and zoning bylaw for inclusionary zoning. Throughout our policy development process, we have really been keeping these three key principles front and center. The first is obvious. We hope to increase the supply of affordable housing. Secondly, we want to create more inclusive, complete, and equitable communities. And thirdly, because we know IZ depends on market developments to deliver affordable housing, we also know that the policy will only be successful in delivering affordable units if market development continues to take place. Every project has unique financial conditions, and so the policy has to be broad enough to create a meaningful number of affordable units while also ensuring general project viability is supported. So the key is finding that right balance between these three principles. To help us find that balance, we've undertaken background analysis work that together makes up our assessment report. And this assessment report is really made up of three separate reports, which are all posted on our website right now. And the province requires us to consider the results from this analysis in the development of our policy. The first report is a financial impact analysis that looks at different levels of affordable housing requirements and how they might impact the housing market and the financial viability of development. We engaged Barry Line consultants to undertake this work. Next, we got a third-party consultant to do a peer review of this first analysis. And then finally, staff undertook an analysis of housing need and demand in the city and different areas of the city. We combined the results of that first financial impact analysis with a review of housing market indicators to determine which areas of the city inclusionary zoning will apply to and how much affordable housing will be required. So the financial impact analysis was undertaken in 2019, 2020, and updated again this year. And this analysis recognizes that developers can only increase housing prices up to what the market can bear. They can't just make up for lower revenues from the affordable housing units by increasing the prices for everyone else. Instead, the impacts of inclusionary zoning are felt by landowners as the value of their land is adjusted to reflect these new affordable housing requirements. However, if the requirements are set too high and land values drop too much, there is a possibility that developers will choose to stop building in that area of the city, or landowners decide not to sell their land for residential development. So this report presents the results of what's called a residual land value analysis. They look at how different levels of affordable housing requirements could impact land values. The latest report, which is available online, has made some changes to factor in our proposed new affordable definitions, which Graham just spoke to, the latest market data and cost information to take into consideration changes since the pandemic began. And they also introduced a second feasibility test to help inform a phase-in strategy for the policy. This second feasibility test was recommended in the peer review report, which is also available online. So the consultants tested 11 test sites across the city, representing a range of market conditions. For each test site, they looked at the residual land value for either condominium development or rental development, providing affordable housing. The analysis assumes that the units stay affordable for 99 years and no city financial incentives are provided to support the affordable housing requirement. So this latest report includes two tests to inform the affordable housing requirements. The first test recognizes that IZ is a forward-looking policy. And so this test looks at whether the residual land value for development with IZ requirements is at least 10% greater than the land value for the existing use on the site, say a strip mall or a gas station. This test helps to inform how much affordable housing could be required in a fully phased-in policy. The second test helps to inform whether introducing inclusionary zoning will create short-term risks. To pass this second test, the land value for a rezoned development cannot decrease by more than 15% when you introduce the IZ requirements. And this second test helps inform the transition and phase-in of the policy. So here's a snapshot of the results for test 1. A blue check mark means the test meets a site past test 1. And so as a reminder, this test informs what could be possible in a fully phased-in policy, meaning that land values have had time to adjust to the affordable housing requirements. The results tell us a few things. The first is that different areas of the city have different capacities to absorb affordable housing requirements. We see Etobicoke Centre and Weston don't pass the test even at a 10% requirement, but other areas like the downtown pass with a 20 to 30% requirement for affordable housing. In order to maximize affordable housing opportunities, we should be grouping market areas and applying the highest affordable housing requirements to the strongest market areas. The results also tell us that a different approach should be considered for purpose-built rental buildings. We can see across all market areas that rental developments are much more challenged to absorb these affordable housing requirements than condo developments. And thirdly, it tells us that generally the affordable housing requirements could range from 10 to 20%, and those would be achievable as we phase in the policy. The second table shows the results for test 2. So a green check mark means that a site passed both test 1 and test 2. And as a reminder, this test informs what could be possible when the policy is first introduced. These results tell us a few things. First, while we can achieve higher requirements down the road, we need to start with a more modest requirements to ensure development continues to be feasible. We should generally start at requirements below 12% for condos providing affordable ownership units, or below 8% for condos providing affordable rental units. The results also tell us that the requirements should be different depending on the tenure of the affordable housing. For example, if you look at number 5 on this list, Yonge Eglinton Centre, it could support an 8% requirement if affordable ownership units are being provided, but it fails the test at an 8% requirement if affordable rental units are being provided. So in order to ensure we're creating both affordable ownership and affordable rental units, they should have different requirements. Over the next few slides, I'll provide an overview of the proposed IZ policy framework, and I'll talk about how the policy has changed from the first 2 rounds of public meetings and how the input we've received from all of you has helped inform where we landed. So first of all, inclusionary zoning will apply to protected major transit station areas, or PMTSAs, that are also located in inclusionary zoning market areas. A few things to keep in mind. First is that the province does not allow the city to implement inclusionary zoning citywide. Instead, we can only implement the policy in areas generally 500 to 800 meters around transit stations. So before IZ can be implemented, the city must update the planning frameworks for these areas to identify minimum densities and delineate the boundaries for those areas. And this framework must be approved by the province. And secondly, we know from our background analysis that different areas of the city show different feasibility results. And so we're looking to implement inclusionary zoning to those areas of the city that have experienced the greatest amount of new housing supply, significant price escalation and growth in rental prices, and areas that pass those feasibility tests. But we recognize that the housing market in Toronto is not static. And so we've committed to reviewing what areas of the city IZ will apply to 3 years after the policy is implemented. So more areas of the city could be subject to these mandatory inclusionary zoning requirements as new investment occurs, as planning frameworks are updated, and as market conditions adjust. So this map shows in the different shades of blue our inclusionary zoning market areas. Inclusionary zoning market area 1 includes the downtown, Bloor, Yorkville, and Central Waterfront. IZ market area 2 includes Toronto East, the western portions of Line 2, Yonge, St. Clair, and North Toronto. And IZ market 3 includes Scarborough City Centre, Southwest Scarborough, South Etobicoke, the North Yonge Corridor, and North York West. Within these blue areas, IZ will actually be implemented to shrink wrap areas around those yellow dots being our transit stations and future protected major transit station areas. And we'll have a map in the zoning bylaw that will outline the specific areas around transit stations where IZ will apply as those PMTSA frameworks are approved by the province. So what has changed since we last spoke with you at our public meetings? Well, we initially consulted, if you might remember, we initially consulted on IZ being implemented in what we were calling strong and moderate market areas. And then following that is when the province changed the direction to implement IZ in protected major transit station areas. And that was incorporated into the policy later that year. We heard from you at the last round of public meetings that we should be applying even higher requirements to the strongest market areas by creating a third market area category. So the policy now outlines IZ market areas 1, 2, and 3, which were formerly known as just strong or moderate market areas. Just taking a step back, I've talked about how we wanted to ensure IZ is implemented in areas where it would continue to support development viability. But our objective is also to help address housing needs through the policy by creating more inclusive and complete communities. This map shows the IZ market areas outlined in purple. And you can see that these are the areas of the city that generally have the neighborhoods with the greatest number of renter households spending more than half of their income towards rent. So the policy will look to create affordable housing opportunities in those areas with the most renters currently living in unaffordable housing. But we also know that as one tool on its own, inclusionary zoning is not going to address all of the city's housing affordability challenges. And as Graham mentioned, there are many programs supporting housing affordability across the city that will continue to be implemented both inside and outside of our IZ market areas. So the proposed policy outlines that new units will remain affordable to low and moderate household incomes for the long term. You might remember we initially consulted on a 25-year affordability period. And we heard from many of you that securing affordability over the long term was your top priority for inclusionary zoning. We also heard that a long-term and income-based affordable housing requirement would support a rights-based approach to housing. The proposed policy outlines that affordable housing units will remain affordable for at least 99 years, and that affordability will be defined based on those proposed new definitions that Graham just spoke to, and which result in lower rents and purchase prices. For new tenants who move into an affordable unit, any rent increases will be limited to the provincial guideline increase. And affordable ownership units will have their resale price restricted to CPI increases to ensure that the unit stays affordable for the next purchaser within those 99 years. There is work underway to establish a fair and streamlined access system for all new affordable housing units created in the city. And so that was one of the questions that came up about how these units will be advertised and accessed. The city is working on creating a centralized portal for advertising and filling all new affordable housing units created in the city. New affordable rental units created through inclusionary zoning will similarly be listed through this new, the city's new system, where the city will determine initial eligibility. We'll do a random draw of interested renters and provide a list of prospective tenants to owners. And the owner is then responsible for doing a final screening, adhering to the Ontario Human Rights Code before signing lease agreements with their new tenants. The new affordable ownership units created through inclusionary zoning will be administered by a third-party administrator that's selected by the city. The third-party administrator will be responsible for providing information to prospective homebuyers and including homebuyer education resources. And so this kind of framework is outlined in our draft implementation guidelines. The policy also outlines that inclusionary zoning will be gradually phased in over time. And this is something that we heard in our last round of public meetings, to include direction that higher requirements will apply over time. It's also advice that we've received from our consultant report and peer reviewer to gradually introduce and increase requirements, allowing land values to adjust over time. So in 2022, condo developments will be required to set aside between 5 to 10% of the total residential gross floor area of the development as affordable housing. And those requirements will increase to a range of 8 to 22% in 2030. And these requirements range depending on what market area the development is located in and whether affordable rental units or affordable ownership units are being secured. So looking at a sample 300 unit condo development, This slide shows how many affordable housing units could be secured in 2020 and 2030, again, depending on the market area and whether affordable rental units or affordable ownership units are being secured. This table shows what specific requirements will be in place for each year between now and 2030. The requirements are really informed by the results of both test 1 and test 2 in the financial feasibility analysis. And so what we're proposing is a measured forward-looking policy that would introduce modest requirements to start, freeze those rates for the first 3 years, and then increase them between 0.5% and up to 1.5% each year until 2030. These base level affordable housing requirements will not be eligible for city financial incentives, but there could be opportunities to layer on incentives, for example, property tax exemptions or development charge exemptions through the Open Door program, where we're securing more affordable housing units or more deeply affordable housing units, targeting lower rents. We've also introduced a regulatory incentive through the zoning bylaw by outlining that affordable housing would have no minimum parking requirements. This recognizes that all of the affordable housing created through IZ will be within a 15-minute walk of a transit station, and that construction costs for underground parking spaces can range from $48,000 to $160,000 per parking space. So what has changed in terms of the affordable housing requirement? Well, in 2019, we consulted on a requirement that 10 to 20% of the density increase of condo developments be affordable. So that's talking about any residential gross floor area beyond existing as of right zoning permissions. We heard in 2019 that the requirement should be based on a percent of the total development and not a percent of the density increase to provide more clarity and certainty about what that requirement would be. So in 2020, we shifted to a 5 to 10% requirement so 5 to 10% of the total development would be required to be affordable. Last year, we heard concerns that the policy should address higher set-aside rates, and that in 2020, we didn't signal how those rates would change over time, and that how higher requirements could apply to the strongest market areas. So this feedback has been incorporated into the proposed policy for 2021. We're still proposing rates ranging from 5 to 10% for the start of the policy, but have now outlined how those rates will increase after the first 3 years. The policy also includes some exemptions that will support broader city objectives of supporting mid-rise and rental projects. Our background analysis and input we've heard from stakeholders has indicated that applying an inclusionary zoning requirement to rental projects now could discourage overall new rental housing supply. We know that rental projects are continually at a disadvantage when competing for land in the city, and we heard the policy should not create additional barriers to building market rental supply. So purpose-built rental developments will be exempt from inclusionary zoning until 2026, and this will provide an opportunity to continue to review market conditions over the next few years and to adjust the requirements at the 3-year review. The policy also proposes exemptions for mid-rise developments with both less than 100 residential units and less than 8,000 square meters of residential gross floor area. These new thresholds reflect that inclusionary zoning is only going to be implemented in protected major transit station areas. And in these areas, many sites would have at least 100 units based on the required minimum densities. So what's changed since we first drafted the policy? We proposed actually similar requirements for rental projects over the past few iterations of the policy, but we're now looking to defer introducing those requirements until 2026. And then initially for mid-rise projects, we proposed exempting developments with less than 100 units if they're located in the downtown, or less than 140 units if they were located in other areas of the city. We've heard a lot of concerns about those thresholds being too high and recommending that it should be closer to 60 units. On the other hand, we also heard concerns that the market conditions are already challenging for mid-rise developments, and IZ could discourage the creation of smaller mid-rise buildings. Additionally, we received comments that one threshold across the city would provide more clarity for the policy. And so we're now proposing that one threshold of 100 units, regardless of whether what IZ market area the project's located in. The policy will, the draft implementation guidelines address a number of questions that came up during our last round of public meetings around integration of the units and requirements for family size and accessible units. The affordable units will share common entrances and amenities with the market units. Standalone affordable buildings will only be considered through a partnership with a nonprofit to address the housing needs of lower income households or equity deserving groups. The guidelines outline that units may be provided off-site in limited circumstances where they provide for an improved housing outcome. So more affordable housing units, more family size units, or more deeply affordable units. There will also be minimum requirements for family sized units, ensuring the number of bedrooms and unit sizes are proportional to the market units in the development. And at least 20% of the IZ units will be targeted as accessible housing units in compliance with the city's affordable housing design guidelines and accessibility design guidelines. The policy outlines a transition period for introducing the requirements for inclusionary zoning. So developments who submit a zoning bylaw application and site plan application before September 18th, 2022 will be exempt. This will provide for about a 10-month transition period. And that September 18th date aligns with the province's deadline for passing a community benefits charge bylaw. It's important to keep in mind, though, that implementation of inclusionary zoning will ultimately depend on when the province approves the city's protected major transit station areas. As I mentioned earlier, we will be reviewing the policy after 3 years, and this will include an update to the background analysis, reevaluating the mapping where IZ applies, and the phase-in schedule for how the requirements for affordable housing will increase over time. We will also be reporting publicly on the outcomes of inclusionary zoning every 2 years, identifying how many affordable housing units have been created, where they're located, what household incomes were supported, and how many family-size units were created. And then finally, as we look to establish the first inclusionary zoning policy for Ontario, we have taken lessons learned from other jurisdictions, but it's really challenging to do an apples to apples comparison from one city's policy to another. There's so many different variables that have to be looked at comprehensively, and this slide doesn't do it justice at all. Some jurisdictions may have higher percentage requirements for affordable housing, but they also might target higher rents. Others may have had voluntary programs in place for decades before moving to higher requirements in a mandatory policy. What we do know, though, is that no two jurisdictions have the same inclusionary zoning policy. Each one is tailored to the city's local housing needs and housing market conditions. And so the policy that we're proposing for Toronto takes lessons from other cities, but ultimately it's informed by the feedback we received through consultation and the background analysis on the city's housing needs and housing market. In terms of next steps for the policy, we will be presenting a report next week to the Planning and Housing Committee with the proposed inclusionary zoning policy, inclusionary zoning, official plan amendment, zoning bylaw, and draft implementation guidelines. That's an opportunity for you to depute and provide comments directly to the council members. Information on how to submit comments or register to address the committee are shown on this slide. Following PHC next week, we expect that the policy, that City Council will make a decision on the policy on November 9th and 10th. As we kind of look towards implementing inclusionary zoning, we're continuing work on those protected major transit station areas so that we're actually able to implement the policy. The report also outlines that we'll report back on the draft implementation guidelines in the first half of 2022. So continuing to consult on those draft guidelines before we finalize them. So that is the presentation. Happy to take questions.
Great.
I saw a lot of comments coming through the chat, but I couldn't read it as I was going.
I know there's been lots of chat comments, which is great. Thanks very much. And I do owe everybody an apology. I understand there was a couple of people who had their hand up during the affordable definition conversation, but for some reason I did not see them. I do see one hand up right now though, so we're going to start there. So we have Elizabeth McGroarty. If you want to unmute them. Thank you, Daniel. Elizabeth, go ahead. Elizabeth, are you with us?
Hello?
Hello, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I think my question was before, not now.
Oh, okay. Is there a question that you wanted to ask now, or are you good for the
No.
moment?
No.
No? Okay. Thanks
Thank
very much, Elizabeth. We do have another hand up, so Tavo Trala.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, yes. Go ahead.
Hi, I wanted to ask if there are, I think a really great project that we saw recently built was the 150 Queens Wharf project with like 25% more affordable housing. And I think that was a great example of more units being allowed to be added because the building included affordable housing. Is that something that's being considered or is in the plan to allow, more units than would normally be available in a building because they're able to include affordable housing or like affordable rentals or affordable condos?
Okay, go for it, Christine.
Yeah, so the policy itself doesn't outline a specific density increase or, additional heightened density that's permitted because of inclusionary zoning. But before we introduce the policy, we do have to do that planning work on protected major transit station areas to outline minimum densities. And of course, we continue to expect rezoning applications to come in for additional densities beyond existing heightened density permissions. But no, the policy itself won't have a specific density bonus.
Okay, thank you.
Before we go to some of the other hands up, there was a couple throughout the chat, a couple of clarification points, I think. One of them, there was a number of questions and comments just to try and get a little elaboration on the test, the feasibility test and the rationale for test number 1 and test number 2, and in particular explaining test number 2 a little bit more, and also to just a sort of a comment that by limiting ourselves to those 2 tests, we weren't able to really see the full possibility, I guess, of whether we could go beyond what the feasibility tests looked at and actually get more. But really just a little bit of an elaboration on the rationale for those 2.
Sure. So
tests.
Both tests were established in the financial impact analysis that was prepared by Barry Lyons Consultants. The first test provides some context for what we could achieve in a fully phased-in inclusionary zoning policy. And that was kind of always part of the first and second drafts of NBLC's report. Then we, as required by the province, we got a third-party peer reviewer to look at NBLC's report, their analysis and recommendations. And they really reinforced many of the recommendations from Barry Lyons around phase-in and transition of the policy, and recommended that the analysis include that second feasibility test to help inform how the city establishes the set-aside rates at the beginning of the policy and to help inform transition and phase-in. And so that second test looks at what would the land value for a rezoned development be right now in the city if there were no inclusionary zoning requirements. And so that's what a landowner would expect to sell their land for. And then it looks at, if you add on those affordable housing requirements, how much would that land value drop? And NBLC, as part of kind of their approach, identified that if it dropped by more than 15%, then it could create short-term risks for the policy, meaning that landowners might not be motivated to sell their land for redevelopment because they were expecting a different price. And so those 2 tests together inform what we can achieve in the future and what we should start out with the beginning of our policy.
Great. Thanks, Christine. The other point of clarification I think is worth mentioning. It was responded to in the chat, but I know there's lots of things going on in that chat. But just why we can only look at the PMTSA areas, and why, given that there's numbers of places outside there that are still unaffordable and within the market areas that we've identified, why are we limited to the protected major transit station areas?
Yeah, so the province, through the legislation that they created allowing the city to implement inclusionary zoning, says we can only apply it to those areas within 500 to 800 meters around transit station areas, or to development permit system areas that have been ordered by the minister. And so really, working within the legislation we have, we can't legally implement inclusionary zoning outside of those PMTSAs.
Great, thanks, Christine. I'm going to go to a person who has their hand up, CL. We're going to unmute you, CL. Dan, go for it. You're unmuted now.
Awesome, thank you. I just had some questions more about test 2. So the studies that informed the fears behind the risk, the market shock, what are those studies that back up that assumption that there would be market shock? And number 2, even if those fears did play out and there was market shock, because the vast majority of housing being built in Toronto today are unaffordable to the vast majority of people who live in Toronto, why would we even care if less of that got built? Like, it's not giving anybody housing, it's giving investors housing. We know the majority are bought by investors, so why would we even care? But again, number 1, what studies inform those fears? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So a 2-part question: what studies, and what happens if we have that market shock, and does it matter?
Yeah, so I'll say most jurisdictions now who introduce inclusionary zoning requirements do this background financial feasibility analysis before they introduce the policy. That's common practice for cities now who are looking to implement inclusionary zoning. Those 2 studies, that Ed Berry Lyons financial feasibility report and the peer review report done by Economic and Planning Systems, they're available on our website if you want to read through them. On your second question, the concern really is that if landowners don't want to sell their land for redevelopment, and that results in no new residential units being built, as you're saying, well, we still need to house people. We get new people coming into the city every year, and we want to continue to support development activity so that we're creating housing options, more and more housing options.
Great, thanks, Christine.
I'd
Oh,
also
go ahead,
jump in, Carla. Yeah, just to make the point, and that Christina raised before, I think given that the province requires us to review our policy after 5 years, we've committed to reviewing at least after 3 years. And that's really critical to make sure that, the assumptions that our consultants have taken, we're going to test those and make sure that, land markets haven't been negatively impacted, that the supply of housing hasn't been negatively impacted. So as part of our 3-year review, we'll be looking at all of these pieces.
Great, so a bit of testing as we go. Thank you both. Let's unmute Mitchell Robbins. Mitchell, you go ahead.
Hey guys, thanks for the presentation tonight. I was just a quick question about future developments that are focusing more on low-rise, single detached and townhouse developments. I understand most of them aren't near the major transit station areas, but just wanted to hear if they are completely exempt from this, or if that's something we should also be keeping an eye on. Thanks.
So if it's like a single detached house, inclusionary, or two houses as part of a development, inclusionary zoning won't apply to it. So it only applies where you're proposing 100 or more units and at least 8,000 square meters of residential gross floor area. So if there was a townhouse development that included 110 units around a transit station, IZ would apply in that case. I don't know how many sites we have like that in the city, but it would if it exceeded that threshold.
Great, thank you. And we're going to take one more raised hand, and then I'm going to go to some of the questions that came in by the chat. So Sean Meager, you're unmuted, Sean.
Thank you. I just wanted to go back to the research and justification behind test 2. In the new NBLC report, it says quite specifically that the 15% cutoff for a market shock was an arbitrary cap. It's not a number that's rooted in market analysis. It's not a number that's rooted in anything else. I'm curious both about why we picked 15% as the arbitrary number instead of 20 or 25, and even more so why we picked one number for the whole set of submarkets when land value increases have been very, very rapid in some areas. 15% represents 6 months or less of land value increases and inflation over the last little while for some areas. And in other areas, it's risen more slowly. This is several years worth of land value inflation. And so, suburban areas get hit much harder than downtown areas in this policy. And the policy itself is specifically identified as arbitrary in terms of its number. So what was the logic behind A, that number, and B, making that number much, much lower in terms of periods of inflation for downtown Toronto than for the suburbs?
Thanks, Sean. So I guess to clarify the concept, like you said, the concept for test 2 was recommended by the peer reviewers. The actual 15% number NBLC established as a methodological choice based off of their experience. And so that 15% was meant to provide a signal around the magnitude of near-term land value impact, and if it could be unsustainable to landowners. But like they also say in the report, they're testing prototypical development sites. And so for an individual development or individual landowner, that threshold, it might be 13%, it might be 16%, it might be higher or lower. And they're providing those prototypical test sites based off of kind of their experience to inform how we set the set-aside rates.
Great. I recognize that Jeremy and Gavin still have their hand up, but I'm just going to pivot over for a couple quick seconds to some of the questions that have come in via the chat. And one of them really relates to understanding if there are specific sizes for affordable units and for the IZ process that are going to be assigned. There are minimum floor areas and things for certain types of units.
Yeah, so the policy itself outlines that to support a range of affordable units that can support families, the affordable housing units have to mirror the unit mix, so number of bedrooms of the market unit. In many secondary plans across the city, so for example, in the downtown, we have minimum requirements for new residential developments to provide at least, in the downtown, it's 40% 2 and 3 bedroom units. And so similarly, those affordable housing units created through inclusionary zoning would have to meet that 40% requirement for family size units. The guidelines for inclusionary zoning also make reference to minimum unit sizes in line with the city's affordable housing design guidelines. And that those minimum unit sizes also have to be proportional to the market unit so that we're not getting all tiny bachelor units instead of a range and mix of units that can house families.
Great, thank you. And then maybe another point, like more of a clarification point again, is that there were a lot of dates within the presentation that you put forward and everything ended at 2030. So what happens after 2030?
Yeah, and so maybe like Deanna said, we'll start with what happens after 3 years. What happens in 2025 when we're reviewing the policy, we're reviewing those set-aside rates and how that phase-in occurs. And at that time, we can check in. Maybe 3 years from now, we extend and we continue to increase those set-aside rates beyond 2030. Maybe we have more aggressive rate increases between 2025 and 2030, or maybe the policies or the results of the policy suggest that we should stick course or lower those rate increases. So I think it all depends on what happens at that 3-year review in 2025.
Okay, great.
But I guess for clarity, the policy will still apply beyond 2030. At a minimum, it'll apply at those set aside rates.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. We're going to go up to Jeremy Withers. You're unmuted, Jeremy.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you again, and congratulations for being near the end of this policy finally bearing some fruit. So I have a question about the decision for how you've set affordability requirements for affordable ownership versus affordable rental. And right now, the distinction is that affordable ownership requirements would need to have about 40% higher affordable requirements than if developers were to choose to provide these as affordable rental. And I've heard I've heard a number of you indicate in the past that the reason you chose to do this was to make it a revenue neutral decision for developers choosing whether to provide to meet their requirements as affordable ownership or affordable rental. And I wanted to kind of press you on that and ask you, are you concerned that this will lead developers to, by and large, choose to provide these as affordable ownership? Also, as you know, I've been conducting a lot of interviews with developers for my PhD dissertation on this topic, and across the board, I've heard them say that they would flock to affordable ownership, to providing that if the choice was revenue neutral. And so I think we're faced with a serious consideration here. If that is in fact the case, this may be producing predominantly units which are affordable to a significantly higher income bracket household than the affordable rental units. And not only that, but also an income bracket that is not caught up in debt and all sorts of things that make it a very particular kind of upper middle income bracket. And so, to conclude, I just think, are you concerned that by making it revenue neutral, this will prioritize the production of affordable ownership with this policy?
Great, thank you for that.
I can jump in here. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the provincial regulation doesn't allow the city to pick one tenure over another. And we're looking at all affordable housing is important in terms of the city meeting our affordable housing goals. We did look at what the value to a developer is if they were going to sell an affordable rental unit versus sell an affordable ownership unit. And we tried to make sure that those were relatively equal. Certainly, developers will pick a different choice depending on their site-specific context and maybe their model and so on. But I would say that in either scenario, we've ensured that there's thorough administration of those affordable units. So if it's affordable ownership units, there will be a third-party administrator ensuring that eligible households access that housing and that they stay affordable over the long term, in the same way as affordable rental. So I think from the city's perspective, we really see this as something that will be negotiated on a site-by-site basis, and that there won't be just, one type of housing over another. But again, going back to that point that we've been talking about, we will be reviewing the policy, and that will give us an opportunity to fine-tune, if necessary, if we're seeing, the delivery of all of one type of housing versus another.
Thanks, Deanna. There is a somewhat related question in the chat, which is, how do you keep affordable studio or bedroom units from being turned into private hotels or Airbnb, and who regulates that? So it's sort of a similar question. How do you manage the stock?
Yeah, so the legal agreements that are registered on title with the owner will require those affordable rental units to stay affordable for the 99 years, and will include some monitoring requirements. So they have to report back to the city on who's occupying those units and whether they're kind of going towards the households in need of housing. As well as I mentioned, those affordable rental units will be listed through the city centralized access system, and so the city is doing that initial eligibility testing for who goes into those rental units.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Someone has asked if we can speak to the relationship between inclusionary zoning and the community benefit charge requirements that are coming.
So there are two distinct planning tools under the Planning Act. Inclusionary zoning is a tool to create affordable housing. The community benefits charge bylaw that the city will be moving to towards next year will be a charge on developments. It'll be equivalent to 4% of the land value as outlined by the provincial regulation, and it'll be used for other more broader community benefits beyond inclusionary zoning. It could include, beyond affordable housing, it could include community benefits for affordable housing, but for other things like daycares, streetscape improvements, other community benefits.
Thank you. I'm going to turn back to the people who have their hand raised. Actually, a quick request to those who have their hand raised. If you spoke, can you just double check and make sure that you've actually lowered your hand? You do that by going back to the same place that you raised your hand and just click on it again, and it should lower itself. So if you could help me out that way, that'd be really appreciated. And I do believe that Gavin, sorry, I thought you'd put your hand down, but it looks like it's back up there. Gavin Bailey. We're going to unmute you now, so go ahead.
Thank you very much and good evening. Just a question of clarity. If you're in Market Area 1 or the downtown area, for example, but outside of a defined delineated MTSA area, does inclusionary zoning apply? And also, is there a master plan of all of the MTSA areas?
So to your first question, no, if you're outside of an approved PMTSA, but still in a market area, IZ does not apply to you. The city has a work plan program for bringing forward major transit station areas and PMTSAs. Maybe someone can drop the link to that work plan in the chat. And Jeff, did you want to add anything?
Hi, sir, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So through the Our Plan Toronto process, which is our municipal comprehensive review, we'll be advancing protected major transit station areas and MTSAs through that process. And if you go to our website and expand the major transit station area tab, you'll see the ones that we've advanced to date. I think we've advanced 30 or between 20 and 30, and it's just it's a program of additional station area delineations for the next couple of months.
Jeff, one of the questions that may have been answered in the chat, but just for clarity here, is whether there is any indication of when these will be officially established, or when the PMTSAs will be kind of etched in stone, so to speak.
Right, so that's a good question. So we at the staff level are reporting out to the Planning and Housing Committee in the next, couple of months, in the last couple of months, with these draft delineations for consultation. And so we introduce them in a draft format, we consult on them, and then we'll send final reports to committee and council, but ultimately the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing is the approval authority of the protected major transit station areas. So we send them up to council, they move them up to the minister, and the minister will approve or amend. So
but
sorry, I think the question was when. You know, our hope is to bring as many as possible in the coming months. We'll have 180 at the end of our work program, so sometime next year. And then when they go up to the minister for approval, again, that process is out of our control.
Great, thanks. Johnny D, we're going to unmute you and let you ask your question. Johnny, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Just a point. So is there any mechanism that the city's looking at to speed up the proposals that have inclusionary zoning in them? I think the city is well aware that many proposals have been put before this bylaw. And so is the city looking to fast track developments with inclusionary zoning? I think it's pretty common knowledge that developments that have sizable Section 37 park affordable benefits do seem to get a quicker approval process. So can anyone at the city speak towards the timing? So will IZ projects be approved faster than non-IZ projects? Thanks.
Great. Christine, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll start, and Deanna, you can jump in if there's anything else to add. So separate from inclusionary zoning, but related, there is a process underway called Concept to Keys to streamline the development approval process. There have been pilots for fast tracking development approvals that include affordable housing. And so that's part of that broader initiative on the Concept to Keys.
Great. Anything else? You said you were going to start, Christine, so nope, nothing else to answer that one? Okay. We've got one more hand raised, and then I think we'll take that as the last hand raised, and then there's a couple of more questions in the chat that we can go to before we finish our evening, but we're going to unmute Nimoy Lewis. Nimoy, go ahead. Are you with us, Nimoy? We can't hear you, unfortunately, so you might be on mute. Okay, we'll check in with you in a few minutes, Nimoy, to see if you might still be with us. So I've got a couple of questions here. One of them is, would IZ be retroactive? And what happens to developers who might rush through their proposals, approved to avoid having the IZ requirements? Are you going to have an opportunity to make them retroactive to the developers?
So the provincial planning framework for inclusionary zoning does not allow us to apply IZ retroactively. It outlines that if a development application is submitted, so a rezoning application and either site plan or plan of subdivision, if that application is submitted, not even approved, before City Council approves the inclusionary zoning official plan amendment, then they would be exempt from IZ requirements. So in summary, we can't apply it retroactively, generally speaking.
There's a couple of questions here about implementation, and I know you mentioned earlier in your presentation, Christine, that there is implementation guidelines still coming, or they'll still be working on those in the new year. But there's a question about, can you elaborate on enforcement responsibilities of the developer and how are they expected to ensure affordable units are given and sold to those who qualify? And there was another question in there too about how someone how would someone know whether they're actually appropriately qualifying and not taking a space inappropriately from someone else? So how does that whole management piece happen?
Yeah, so developers won't be the ones determining who goes into those affordable ownership units. As I mentioned, the draft guidelines outline that those affordable ownership units will be administered and managed by a third-party administrator that's selected by the city. So the city will establish eligibility requirements that the third party will enforce and make sure any prospective families looking to buy these affordable ownership units meet those requirements before that sale is made.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi, Carla, it's Abby here. Can I just maybe add something to that answer? So Council has given staff direction to go away and really kind of rethink the access to housing for kind of all affordable housing that we're creating along kind of multiple programs, Housing Now, the inclusionary, affordable home ownership, and they've asked us to look at that and report back later this year or early in the next year. So we're actively working on a process which will streamline people's access into that type of housing. So there ideally will be one port of entry, if you like, one portal where people can find out what units are available, and a clear eligibility and a clear access into that housing. So we're working on that right now, and there'll be substantive reports back to council before we're at a point where we have to implement this.
Great, thank you. And there also too was a question about whether the city is going to get involved in things like arranging financing and mortgages, et cetera, for people to be able to purchase or rent IZ units. And I think you sort of answered that, Christine, that it's going to be managed by certainly not the developers, but I'm not sure if there's any more elaboration to provided there. Nimoy, we're going to take you off mute and see if you're still there and if you still had a question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. My question is in regards to the areas that were not included in the particular map with respect to that are not eligible for inclusionary zoning. And more specifically, my question is in regards to the Eglinton West community, more specifically the Little Jamaica community. And I was wondering why specifically that area was not included in that, considering the fact that the gentrification pressures that this particular community is facing, and are we waiting for these particular areas to no longer be affordable in order to respond to the challenges that this community is facing?
Okay, so that's an example of a community that's expressing or feeling the pressure. And is there a reason why it wasn't included? And how do we manage that moving forward? I guess really when as communities gentrify.
Yeah, and so I think the first thing to really keep in mind is that the provincial regulation has a number of different pieces of information that the city needs to look at when determining whether IZ can apply. And so that includes market indicators like the cost of land, market housing prices, and so on. So in all the work that we did, we looked at all the changes to those market indicators over the past 5 years. And so there were a number of areas of the city that inclusionary zoning won't apply to because we just didn't see that market viability. And it's not only areas like Little Jamaica, but we know Etobicoke Centre, other parts of Eglinton, and other parts of the Finch West LRT also don't have IZ applying to them. I think what we know is we want to make sure that going forward as part of any review, we're looking at these sites and doing a deeper dive, especially as planning frameworks come forward. And finally, through any planning studies, we will make sure that they are quote unquote PMTSA ready, meaning that if IZ, our market analysis shows that it is able to be implemented, that we can basically implement it right away with an approved PMTSA.
Great, thank you. We're going to stop it there because we're pretty much at our time. I wanted to thank everybody for participating. Christine, I don't know if you want to put up that last slide so that there is a couple of contact information there that people might be interested in. So the city, as Christine mentioned, that she'll be trying to post the video that we've recorded early next week and the presentation early next week as well. On the slide there is your opportunity to attend and depute at Planning and Housing Committee and the information about the work that is continuing. And then Christine, I don't know if you wanted to say more about the slide. No, okay, so the other, go ahead.
No, I think you covered it. There's the contact information. If you now that you kind of have a better understanding of what's being proposed, if you want to share your feedback with councillors at the Planning and Housing Committee, you can submit those comments to that email address or call them to register to depute.
Great, so that's phc@toronto.ca or 416-397-4579. And also too, if you have questions, particularly if you want to get those questions in prior to attending that committee meeting, that last slide, if you want to flip to the last slide there, includes the contact information for Christine and Graham, who are both available to answer your questions and talk about things with you when you have a chance. So we really appreciate everybody's questions and comments, and we will be consolidating them in the notes of the meeting and posting those when they are available. And thanks really very much for participating in the inclusionary zoning adventure we've all been on. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.